Welcome, everyone, to the program in Middle East and North African Studies at Northwestern University. This is our Monday speaker series. For those of you who are not familiar with our program, I'm Rebecca Johnson, the director, and I'm just going to say a few words by way of introduction today to both our fantastic speakers and the conversation structure, and just to welcome you all to our virtual space here. And it's so lovely to see some familiar faces that are even not from the Chicago area. Hello, everyone. We're really delighted and honored to host Mona Kareem today. Dr. Kareem is a writer, literary scholar, and literary translator working between Arabic and English. Her English translation of Ashraf Fayadh's Instructions Within was nominated for the Best Translated Book Award in 2016. It was reprinted by Penn in 2017. And her selected translations of the Iraqi poet Ra'ad Abdulqadir will be published by Ugly Duckling Presse this spring, so watch out for that. And her Arabic translation of Octavia Butler's Kindred, about which we're going to talk today, was released by Takween, publishing in fall of 2020. So it's brand new. Dr. Kareem holds a PhD in comparative literature from SUNY New York, Bennington, and she's taught at SUNY Bennington, Rutgers, Brooks Community College, and the University of Maryland at College Park. And she's been an affiliated research fellow at the Friedrich Schlegel Graduate School of Literary Studies at the Free Universität of Berlin, and most recently translator in residence at Princeton University's Program in Translation and Intercultural Communication and the Council of Humanities. She's the author of 3 poetry collections, most recently in 2019, a trilingual collection entitled Femme Ghosts, which is also a beautiful design object in really lovely translations. And her work has been translated into 9 languages. It's appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, Michigan Quarterly, Fence, Ambit, the LA Review of Books, Asymptote, Words Without Borders, Poetry International, Penn English, among others, and I'm sure I'm missing a few of those, more than a few even. And she's been a featured writer at festivals and conferences in Cairo, Istanbul, Berlin, Amsterdam, Brussels, Seoul, Copenhagen, and across the US. And we're just really delighted to be talking with Mona today. And she'll be in conversation with Justin Mann, and Justin is an assistant professor of English at Northwestern. Dr. Mann's research and teaching interests include African-American literature, speculative fiction, Black feminist theory, and queer of color critique, and security studies. And his current project, entitled Breaking the World, Blackness and Insecurity After the New World Order, explores the interpenetration of speculative fiction and security policy to understand the underexamined connection between these two seemingly disparate fields of writing. So this work brings together Octavia Butler, Walter Mosley, Colson Whitehead, and N.K. Jensen into conversation with security police in practice. And Breaking the World argues that Black speculation is an overlooked but essential archive for understanding America's security ambition since the Reagan administration. Professor Mann's work has appeared in feminist theory, feminist studies, and surveillance in society, and includes essential reading for today, in my opinion, a fantastic article entitled Pessimistic Futurism, Survival and Reproduction in Octavia Butler's Dawn. So thank you, Justin, for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Justin now to direct the conversation. Justin and Mona are going to speak for about 40 minutes, and afterwards we'll open the conversation to questions. At that point, you can use the chat or the raised hand function, or you can also private chat me a question if you'd like me to answer it by proxy. That's fine with me. So please join me in a very warm virtual welcome to both Mona Kareem and Justin Mann. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and for having me, and thank you, Mona, for taking the time to chat with us all today. I do want to say that the text, for anyone who's unfamiliar, does deal with questions of sexual assault and consent, and so this is a general content warning in case our conversation does enter into those areas. If you feel at all affected by that, please feel free to mute the sound or step away. So I wanted to start, Mona, just asking you to offer us a brief summary of the plot of Kindred, just so we can all be on the same page. And if you can, in your summary, speak to what drew you to Butler's work in general, and specifically to the translation to translating Kindred.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Rebecca, for the invitation, and Justin. I'm excited to have this conversation with you, especially at the intersection of different, area studies and fields that rarely come in conversation, sadly, I would say. I wanted to show just like a copy of the book It's somehow, I don't know how to explain this, but it's somehow expanded 200 pages in Arabic, you know. So everyone keeps asking me, how did you do this? Like, when did you do this? 500 pages? I'm like, no, it's shorter. Yeah, and by coincidence, you know, most of the project was done during the pandemic, and I think that really helped me survive the pandemic, you know, like how much translation you know, is something between, yeah, like it's not as challenging and intimidating as writing, yet it still keeps you active to some level. Yeah, to introduce Kindred, you know, I don't know, because I feel like we, at least for this audience, you know, we might have different levels of knowledge about Octavia Butler, right? Like through this translation, I met some, you know, Butler fanatics who like know all her work, people who are even more devoted than me. So like, I loved that encounter. But, you know, in case you're someone who've never read any of Butler's work, and I really believe, even though there's so much interest around her work, I really believe like, you know, every generation like encounters her work, you know, so like we always are returning to her work. So I can say that Kindred stands out from the rest of her work because it's not a classical or an expected sci-fi novel that we know of her work. You know, it was her one attempt to be like, you know what, I can also write realist or historical realist fiction, you know, and it was a project that really stayed with her for many years and like required a lot of research. And you know, she was trying to do something specific, which I hope we get to discuss, you know, today. So maybe if I can put it simply, you know, this can be, you know, this has been classified as neo-slave, you know, literature, right? And you know, it's like for her generation of Black writers looking back at slavery, how do you write about such an experience, such history, like, and of course the intimidation of like such experience, like, can you cover it, and are you going to reduce it? Like, how do you deal with all of these things, you know? So all of these questions come up in the book. So we have Dana, who is like the main character, a young Black woman from California, finds herself without explanation time traveling to Maryland, early 19th century, and discovers that, you know, she's being summoned by someone who she has to save every time he is facing a threat of death. So she discovers basically that this time travel is happening because it involves her ancestors, and therefore it involves her own existence. So, you know, I really think of this novel as like a world building of the slavery experience, right? Like and you know, when I say world building is so important in sci-fi and speculative fiction, so Butler uses this, you know, this powerful technique that sci-fi writers have to world build, and the way she is able to challenge this, you know, spatial and temporal boundaries and the linearity is by using the time travel. Of course, here I can say one thing is that in sci-fi, traditionally, when time travel happens, usually that becomes part of the plot, like to understand how does it happen, right? But that's not really the case in Kindred, you know. A lot of unanswered stuff also in Kindred. So yeah, I hope this gives you an idea of like what is the novel about.
Great, thank you so much, Mona. I think the point about every generation discovering Butler, I think is really resonant. And we're seeing this sort of Butler renaissance happening now around television adaptations and comic book adaptations. And of course, your work is sort of participating and also extending the reach of Butler, you know, which is something I think we can definitely and should definitely talk about in a little bit. But since we're talking about translation, and since I am not a translator and I'm not a comparativist, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the work of translation in general, how you approach it and how you approached it specifically in this context. And I'm especially interested also in how translation as a sort of, as a mode, inflects your own poetic practice, like your own original work.
I would say, okay, in my experience, I'm one of few people who like translate between Arabic and English in both direction. But you know, this is maybe not common in the United States, but back home it's very common. I think in the Middle East, I think in many contexts, really, in third world literatures, you know, translating from and to is normal. So when I was still living in Kuwait, you know, I used to approach translation in a very like I guess not oriented way, in the sense like I would come across a text and I would love it and I'd be like, oh, it's not translated, and I just feel like I want to be in service of this text. I want to share this beauty, you know. And I would, you know, I would translate or publish it, you know, online in a newspaper, whatever. So I never had to think about my translation practice until I came to the US, where everything is regulated, really, right? Like the industry of publishing, of writing, intellectual production, you know, of course, the influence, of course, of academia on me as well, like of like asking yourself questions like, why do I do this, right? Like beyond just like, I enjoy it, you know, which is, by the way, absolutely legitimate. You can't just do it because you enjoyed it, you know. But I got infected with with reason, I guess. And I just felt, you know, after, so to give you a little bit about my research, which really somehow connects to this, you know, because I study contemporary Arab feminist novels. And we've had this phenomenon, I call it a phenomenon in the past 2 decades of, you know, the feminist novel becoming so popular, you know, it's becoming best-selling, you know, even though it's not like, it's not pop culture necessarily. Actually, all these writers engage with really important issues. And somehow by coincidence also, I don't know if it's coincidence, but a lot of these women writers feel like they have a common ground with, let's say, subaltern groups to talk about them. So now we have like all these middle-class citizen women writing about experiences of slavery, of migration, exploited migration, especially, of writing about statelessness, you know. So I am personally a stateless of Kuwait. So I started asking myself the question, like, why, right? And how do they do this? Like, how can you write about such experiences that are difficult, contested, and silenced, you know? They're not like even studied or something, you know, just recently. So I can say so much about like how lately there has been an interest in contemporary Arabic fiction to write about these marginalized groups and their histories, but specifically Black Arabs or encounters with Africans, you know, who are not necessarily Arab or in Arab countries. Speaking about Indian Ocean slavery, right, especially in like, let's say, early 19th century, you know, and also because at least in the Arab Gulf, for example, you know, when slavery was abolished, it was also the at the time of state formation. You know, there was an idea of like, you know, of course, British colonialism of like, you gotta do these set of things to make your nation state, right? So I think in Arabic literature, we have so much interest in talking about race. It's so new to us, you know, and we don't have any orientation or direction of like, how do we do this, right? And not to say like some people didn't do a good job, you know, I think there are some works out there worth exploring. And this is when I come across Kindred and I'm like, wow, this is wonderful. Like, you know, like how does, you know, it's amazing that fiction is able to like recreate all of this and make it complex and not, you know, not reduce the pain of past people, you know. And so and the powerful thing is this time travel, because, you know, she is able to bring the sensitivity and the vulnerability of the modern man, who is also entitled, right? Like the modern man has nothing but his speech or their speech, right? So and puts it into the test, you know, in a place where, you know, you could die for saying a word, right? Like, so these limitations, and it plays on multiple levels. It plays on Black intellectual conversations level, you know. It plays on how do we understand oppression, how does literature help us, you know, revisit these experiences, you know, etc. So yeah, sorry for the long answer, but yeah, like I feel like I was very intentional in this translation project.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much. I'm really drawn to what you're saying, especially about the, in Black studies, we talk about the afterlives of slavery, and that can, and in some ways, be a kind of circumscribed, like very racially specific formation, right? We're thinking about, you know, the ways in which anti-Black violence or policing or mass incarceration, right, is a way of continuing and extending the kind of social relations that were birthed in 1619 that continue into the present. But the question of how the political utility of thinking coercion and unconsent and various other forms of oppression that linger today and that have like really extended the reach of a kind of global white supremacy and heteropatriarchal project, especially into places like the Indian Ocean, forced movement. All those things are really important, and it does really enliven for me how like what is important about Kindred as like a text that is both racially specific and sort of multivalent and multivocal. You brought up Blackness and the relationship between, or maybe the sort of critical inflection between like contemporary Black subjects in the U.S., in the world, and how Black people sort of are interrelated with other people in the Middle Eastern diaspora and throughout Black people all over the world. So I want to ask you specifically about Blackness and think about how you encountered the construction of Blackness in this other context, right? For an Arabic reading public that maybe is relating to Blackness in the US context, but is reading in Arabic, but also in thinking about how Blackness is constructed as a global phenomenon. Like, did you find yourself rethinking certain descriptions or rethinking certain like even some of the language around Blackness, right? That is like mobilizing epithets to help us understand that. So I'll say it this way. So we find one of the ways we find that Dana has been taken out of time is through the anachronism of the epithet used to describe Black people Black enslaved people in the well, and still used today, but in the 19th century specifically, right? So my question is, did you encounter any trouble around that kind of translation? Does it require a completely different frame? What does it do to make the context of the discrete form of American anti-Blackness kind of mobile in the global imaginary?
Beautiful. I mean, actually, as you're speaking, I'm like, oh yeah, I never thought about the fact that when Dana is taken, it's like also an abduction, like, just because, she like for a while, she does maintain her modern, person being, there, and like that kind of agency and confidence, but also like this barrier, like, oh, I'm watching this, so it does trick me, but yeah, it's absolutely an abduction in this sense. I guess I would like to say that there is, like throughout the process, throughout the text, because especially, as a translator, you get on some annoyingly intimate level with the text, where you're like, wow, like, like I've spoken before about how much, like the novel affected me even mentally, like feeling trapped inside the text. But I want to say there were moments like between these two historical contexts as well, the contemporary context, where they meet or, depart, but in both ways, it's interesting to examine, So for example, I think, there are very particular details about the processes of slavery, like for example, when she describes like several times she describes the scenes of the coffles, right, of the selling and buying, and I remember, like wondering, how do I translate kafel? And I look it up, and it turns out it comes from the Arabic 18th century, qafila, right? So I'm like mind blowing right away, because I'm like, this is not a coincidence that this word specifically travels all the way to the United States, like, and transforms in this way, that means like even the practice has traveled, right? Like of in itself, So I had to. This is something that might be missed for the reader, when they're reading. So I had to put this in the translator note. I'm like, listen, sometimes, like these words carry echoes of our own past in other people's lives, and I'm really interested in thinking about this. So, because I feel like a lot of the times there has been an approach of like, as if the Black American experience is like some exceptional thing, isolated, right? Like it's like, and I think, that's not the case, like the enslavement happened in different places, and Afro enslavement happened in different places, and writers, create these contexts where sometimes these words come to meet together. Yeah, so I think there are places where we can, like there are points between texts that you can put in conversation, but there are points where you're like, no, this is a specific experience as well, right? And like, how do I, carry this along? Maybe, for example, you gave me the detail of the time travel. How does it come off? I said, part of the challenge of translating Kindred is that we don't have sci-fi in Arabic. We, of course, we have writers here and there writing, but we don't have that genre writing even in general. As a category, and I don't think I've seen that people have also attempted to be like, no, there is Arab sci-fi, and they would go back and examine the canon and say that. And I'm like, yeah, of course, there is all possibilities, but I am personally suspicious of like trying to globalize Western genres, and genre is in itself Western construct after all. But I saw an opportunity here. I was like, if Arabic readers are not familiar with time travel, maybe they would feel less suspicious of the fact that, she is bringing sci-fi and historical realism in one place, right? Maybe they would be more receptive to this. And my publisher says that, whenever he tries to tell people like, oh, it's a sci-fi novel, they're suspicious. They're like, oh, they imagine like Star Wars, basically, when you say that, but then when they read it, they really don't, this detail of time travel doesn't really block them from something. And it's perceived more as fantasy, which is, I guess, like one of the labels she also proposes for this novel. So I feel like in these gaps, like that, or differences even, let's say, in aesthetic, there's so much to venture into and like I guess build upon as well, so it's been really enjoyable to translate, but also to process what I've done after.
Thank you so much for that. I'm really taken by the way you describe genre as this sort of Western commitment, and on like, sort of, in the one hand, agree wholeheartedly with you about how, especially science fiction is a form, to me, and the way that I describe it in my work, that sort of reproduces the mastery of the West, right? That is like all about colonization, whether here or in the sort of throughout the universe, right? It's about manipulation. So like working at the level of the gene or the biome to sort of, to master the context of the world. And it's why I use the word sorry, one of the joys of working at home is there's some work happening in my house. So if you hear a loud noise, I'll try to stop. I try to use the language of the speculative to be more inclusive around what counts as the, what Darko Suvin called the sort of estranging process of science fiction. And so I'm wondering if like what happens, because what we don't get in the story is a real explanation for how Rufus, this is Dana's ancestor, is pulling her back to save his life. We only know that it's sort of this metaphysical like yank, as the text describes it. And so I think what you're calling us to think about is like, well, what happens when we theorize speculation or theorize the process of the generic that is not quite realist, right? It's using realism, but engaging all other kinds of storytelling to articulate social problems or to think with social problems. So I'm not sure if there's quite a question in there, but I'm just thinking too with like, with the sort of magical realist tradition in Latinx writing, or whether mysticism in various different kinds of practices or oral traditions that think outside of the framing of the Western literary market, which I think you're right, does want like a sort of neat and tidy, like here's a detective novel, here's romantic fiction, what have you. Maybe we can think a little bit with what we're talking about in terms of genre. So given that you're saying that your intended audience, right, at least Arabic readers, and don't maybe have the cultural context for time travel, as you just said, like what do you do as a translator to scaffold that in, right? Because so much of what Butler is doing is saying like, you think you know what time travel is. I'm just going to yank time travel out of its cultural context and just use it. So like, who cares about H.G. Wells? I'm just going to like bring Dana back in time. So you're working in the other direction. How did that inflect your writing?
Yeah. Well, I want to say something about sci-fi also in Arabic, or, I know that now people are using also speculative fiction as a bigger umbrella. It makes sense, and I see that, for example, I want to mention that, say, like after the Arab revolutions, we've had like a stream of novels that were categorized as dystopian novels, which, and part of me wonders is like, is it really dystopian when we are like thinking about dystopia all the time, all of us collectively, right? And like witnessing the decay and witnessing, crisis, all of that. So, and also the relationship of like how dystopia is always placed in the context of the neoliberal city, right? Like, and what that means for the future of the, let's say, post-colonial city or third world city. So like we always have these waves coming and going. And when I did my research on like who wrote like sci-fi, especially from like established Arab writers, like I've noticed that someone like as enigmatic as San'Allah Ibrahim, the Egyptian novelist, who is like considered a committed novelist, really wonderful writer, political, but sometimes gets wild, with his imaginative worlds, so prison writing as well, so not really the guy I would expect to write sci-fi, right? But he made attempts to write specifically about cloning, and that was apparently a concern for his generation because they're Marxist and they're like, oh, like now like the evil man is wants to replace us, right? So like that was a concern for them, a political concern. But I understand why like sci-fi in its traditional like history would not be appealing to Arabic because like this idea of colonizing space and the promise of technology, these were not like in conversation in third world context, right? Like matter of fact, they were critiqued. The wonderful thing about like getting involved with Butler is I got a whole education on how sci-fi writers since the 50s have been like counter culture, very critical, leftist, like they anti-capitalist, even even braver than what is considered like classically fiction, right? Which is really also defined in elitist terms, right? Like and gated against genre writing. So this is just like to give a comparative impression of both. But if I speak more about the time travel, I really thought of this as like as you said, she takes it out and she's like, why not, right? And I feel like it's such a great solution to the issue of linearity that just like corrupts a lot of fiction, and because she understands the problem of like we cannot examine this as modern people, we cannot, how do I disable your moral entitlement and grounding, as the modern reader. So she proposes this time travel as a way to challenge linearity and to disable your judgment as a modern reader. And I think this is something that I feel like in Arabic fiction we also need, and we are right now, the historical novel is so big in Arabic, and I feel a lot of time we are not able to be as critical. So I thought like Kindred is a great like text to think around and to learn from in that sense. How does aesthetic serve your political vision or intervention, you know, in that sense.
Thank you so much, Mona. This has been great. I am hearing this again. I'm trying not to enforce too much of what my perspective on what you're saying, but I'm sensing too a bit of well, you tell me if I'm right, but when you talk about this sort of this leftism that inflects science fiction writing, so much of how I understand Butler, not in relation to the other Black feminist sort of speculative realists that she's writing with, but rather her relationship to these white men who are writing science fiction in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, is to say that like you can't have a left critique of the world without rooting that critique in identity, right? So you can be anti-capitalist all you want, and so much of what's happening, especially with the new wave in science fiction, but also with various other movements in science fiction studies, and this maybe is too far beyond your scope, so you don't have to respond, but is that this is emerging out of an Eastern European tradition, right? Or it's at least an encounter with the Eastern European tradition that is deeply invested in thinking about how the failures of Soviet communism, the relationship between the East and the West that has no account for the quote unquote third world, right? And so to me, what Butler offers is like, yeah, you can answer all of those questions, but if you don't get down to the sort of fundamentals, you know, really thinking about how the human, right, is taken up and mobilized as a political modality, not actually as a sort of materialist object or whatever, that we can't get anywhere, right? We can't have a conversation. I'm thinking specifically, and one of the ways I think she does this is by leading with affect, right? So the novel opens, the prologue, we're in a hospital room, something has happened to our main character, we don't actually know. And so formally, Butler is going to do the returning, right? She's going to give us the end of the story. We have to go back to see how it happened, which like reproduces the narrative, in which Dana is pulled back in time. But all of this is rooted around pain and the injury of Dana losing her arm. Her arm gets stuck in a wall and it hurts. And so, you know, Butler has described Kindred as a project that is oriented to making people or helping people feel slavery. And so I'm wondering what kinds of sort of poetic practices you use as a translator to think with like mood and tone to help we can do this sort of ideological work, I'm saying, of understanding that slavery was bad and that enslavers were horrible and that it's kind of like a lamentable thing intellectually, but like the sense that it is a harm, that it works on the body in the present. I'm wondering how you approach that question in your work.
Yeah, I think that was really like one of the main things about this experience, you know, the affect, as you said, or, you know, the body and how central it is, you know, from the beginning. As you said, it opens up with the injury at the hospital, and, you know, circling back to it at the end, and, you know, even like leaving it out there, you know, just like with, again, another thing without explanation, but I guess that's something more open to interpretation. You know, I was thinking of it as more a temporal like gap, but also you can think about it as something of like, you know, it really does mirror the experience of reading the novel itself, because you go into that violent context, you know, and live that across different years, right? Because she returns at different points. And after you survive this whole experience as a reader, you know, you feel like you lost something, right? You lost something, but is it really a loss as much as that you've been altered, right? You've been altered, and you know, like you're not complete after this. Not that, matter of fact, you know, it reminds you that you were never complete before either. So I felt like the body or the affect is like so central to the novel, even when we start the novel with them working, I mean, not at the beginning, a bit after, when she meets Kevin and they are just like, they work temp jobs, right? And, you know, she describes all these feelings of being, you know, someone who works blindly, right? Like she says, like, you don't even need a brain to do these kind of jobs, you know? And she, like, in a very subtle way, tries to compare, like, how did capitalism recreate slavery, right, in today's world, you know, and she like hints at it here and there, and that's something she continues to do. She wants to remind us like how our present emerges from the past, you know, it's not in separation from that past in the US. So I wanted to say that also, like, I think the prose, you know, even like, for example, I noticed one issue when how much Butler describes the body, right? Like everything happens because, you know, like Dana loses her power of speech, right? Which is what she has. She always like took it for granted, even in a sense, right? But a lot of the time, the way she copes with this is that she learns that, okay, maybe you respond with your head, with a nod, or you shrug, or, you know, you, I don't know, you hum. So especially shrugging, that was funny for me because we don't have a verb for this in Arabic, you know. I could say it, but like in 2 words, for example. So I would translate it, and then it got on my nerves. I was like, oh, like this is it's happening too many times. Like, what can I do about this, you know? And then later on in the novel, I realized like, oh, this is so essential to the prose and to the affect and to the impact that, you know, this novel has on the reader, is that she wants you to feel this in the body, and she wants you to feel this, you know, how speech is impossible, right? And can you contend with this experience, you know, on the physical level, right? And I personally felt it, you know, I personally felt exhausted, I felt burned out, I felt suffocated, I felt suicidal, I felt like, you know, like all these moments in the novel just like really got to me. And I realized like I usually like to listen to music instead of anything, you know, vocal while translating or writing, but I had to change from jazz to like rock music, you know. I was like, I need to remind myself to be angry, right? Like, or to be, I don't know, feel something, because at some point I felt pacified too with Dana, you know. I felt helpless and pacified. I felt like, you know, captured in the moment, and just like waiting for just like the next moment, you know. I can't think more longer than that, you know. So this happened in the novel because, in the translation, because, you know, I made sure I'm intentional about this. How do I give like this description of the body that she gives in detail, how she has like this dense prose, you know. I maintained all of this, even if that means, I don't know, some repetition, because it agitates you at the beginning, but then later you understand how it takes a toll on you, you know. And I love how with Butler, when you start a novel, you're like, oh, I love her dialogues, but then later in the novel you're like, no, I love the prose. Like, it's this is where she does the work, really, you know.
Yeah, I totally, I don't want to fan out too much on Butler's prose, but I think there's so much dialogue and so much narrative that it's easy to lose what is really beautiful, beautiful prose. That I think one of the things you're calling me to think about, you talk about pacification, right? And so the novel ends with Butler, with Dana returning. She's lost her arm, and she's sort of made her way out of this arrangement, this like really violent and captive relationship with her ancestor by killing him, right? And there's no triumphalism around that. And you're inviting me to think too about just the way that we think. She describes Dana as a hero in some of her interviews, right? And we're, I think, inclined to think Dana, we're inclined to think heroism on a kind of Western telos, which is about, like, you know, in that sort of Joseph Campbell way, like, you go out into the world, you slay the monster, you come back and bring a boon to the community. But I've been reading also Samantha Pinto's work, and the way that you're describing the sort of your encounter with the text as like embodying a kind of passivity, or pacification, not passivity, that, you know, what does it mean to think of a hero in a completely different register? Or what happens when that heroism is about like acknowledging the way in which like this kind of violence, whether discursive or embodied or sort of structural, is a harm to all, and like, of course, to some more than others, but that it really kind of constrains the limits of flourishing, of happiness, of of questions about like human engagement and human sharing and community, which is just so beautiful. So I want to thank you for that. I want to ask, I guess, one last question before we move into the Q&A, which is about kind of saying on a similar theme, but you describe yourself as, or your scholarship as being invested in these questions of sort of like global, of Arabic feminisms, but maybe kind of broadly construed. And so I'm wondering if we haven't covered at all yet, though we have kind of covered a lot, like how do you understand Butler's, the question of feminism is one that sort of lays over Butler's work, right? Like, was she a feminist? Wasn't she? She describes herself as a feminist pretty vociferously in all kinds of interviews and her own writing. And so what do you think about reading Butler and translating Butler not only as a writer, not that these things are separate, right? But thinking about her as a writer intellect or as a writer theorist, a sort of a theorist of feminism. How do you relate to that, or have you thought about that before?
Yeah. Well, I guess like two things to say in this direction is like, you know, just because we were speaking about like, you know, the violence of slavery, and to be honest, like, you know, you can never think about the violence of slavery in separation from like, you know, how it is also a woman's experience, you know, or necessarily, you know, like, and I think, you know, Butler is one of the pioneers to think like, I gotta revisit this history from the point of view of the Black woman, right, or the enslaved woman, I like, and then, you know, after Kindred, we have a few years after, we have, I guess, a few years, maybe a decade. I can't remember when Beloved was published, but, you know, to think that Butler wrote this and then Beloved was published, you know, and to think also about the fact that how magic worked in for Toni Morrison in Beloved in like such spectacular way. And it was interesting actually going back and reading reviews of Beloved and how critics were so suspicious of the magical aspect, like, oh, like this doesn't make sense, you know, like you're writing about this history, you know, so all these speculative, you know, like methods and aspects that, you know, Black writers have used, they were always, you know, put to speculation, or put to, you know, questioning, like, oh, you know, as if like, because the history is this this violent and this heavy, so therefore somehow you need to stick by realism. And I think this equation is widespread across the world, really, you know, like this idea that realism is self-justified in a way, or has like a moral grounding in a sense. But I think, yeah, I think, you know, the wonderful thing about Kindred is that, you know, it is a maternal narrative, right? Like she goes back, you know, Dana is connected more to her mom's side, right? Because her dad died early on. And then, you know, when she goes back in time, she's actually exploring her, you know, ancestors from the maternal side as well. You know, so I thought that was wonderful too, because, you know, if you think about it, I mean, that's how, you know, people survived slavery. You know, women were at the center of this, right? As you know, like for the family to survive slavery, at least in the US context, you know. So for that project to have happened, it's you know, it's really wonderful. And I think one other thing I want to say about the feminism, because, you know, I don't think, you know, one thing needs to erase the other. Of course, like these writers, Butler, Toni Morrison, and others, you know, were interested in like merging both. And I see this, for example, in the way how Kindred, even though the mission is so big, she did not hesitate to explore sexual violence, for example, right? She was like, you know, that's another main mechanism of slavery, you know, like rape, you know, even like forcing the woman to have children, you know, or as a reproductive machine for the enslaver, right? Like, so she doesn't shy away from exploring all kinds of oppression in one context, you know, and she doesn't think that just because this experience is so difficult and graphic doesn't mean like I can't you know, reflect on it, right? In all this, on all these different directions. So I loved how, for example, Butler treated rape, you know, and I loved how she was able to circle back at this in the end, you know, because it just all fell well in this whole material exploration that she has, you know. It's just like, yeah, it scores well in different layers of the narrative. So I think there is so much to learn from that, and I think it's not a coincidence that the translations of Kindred that have happened in the past few years were all done by feminist translators, you know, so like there is a lot in conversation here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think for me, the feminism, or Butler's like particular vision of Black feminism is a theory of transformation, as you've articulated. So we even see Kevin, right, this white man with whom Dana's in love. So Dana's never excused from her own sort of attachment to whiteness, right? She's in love with and married to a white man, and they have their, but there's also anxiety around that in the text, right? So she treats it as a very realistic sort of thing, and then he gets pulled back in time with her at one point, and undergoes a pretty serious transformation, becomes an abolitionist, right? Almost loses his life, is kind of hunted by people who didn't want Black people reading and enslaved people to be able to read. So yeah, I think, I don't know, it's a wonderful novel. If you haven't read it, go check it out, read everything she's ever written, and you will see that these questions persist throughout in ways that are really exciting and evocative. So hopefully more translations in the future. I want to pick up something you last asked and pick up on the second question in the chat, and then we can come back to the first question, and I'll invite you to ask more questions in the chat and raise hands as you see. But I want to ask about the question of goal and method, and you specifically in your very last answer flagged that all of these translations are happening or are being translated by feminist translators. So in addition to just like a sort of statement about goal and method in terms of translation, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what a kind of feminist-oriented translation praxis looks like, or a queer-oriented translation practice. Yeah.
Yeah, I really don't know if like my methodology is necessarily feminist, you know, because I think, you know, the text itself is already constructed with that, you know, ethos, I guess, you know. So like I really didn't have to interfere much in that sense, and I feel like most of the, you know, like negotiations that I have had to do are either like aesthetic, right, or historical, you know, that requires some kind of research, you know, like for example, you know, you have all these cultural contexts that she built, you know, we have 1970s California, but then we have like Maryland across the 19th century, and like Butler is amazing in the way that she makes every character distinct by their age group, gender, context, and of course the Southern dialects versus, you know, California, which by the way, she didn't really do much with California. It was more like, it felt like more standard English, I guess, to some level. And, you know, so all these like layers, I guess, of culture that just like, again, you know, enhance that feeling of like, you know, world building and summoning that world into the current moment. So I don't know if I have much with the methodology, but I feel like I spoke a lot about the goals, you know, because you know, again, you know, the interest of Arabic literature, because I feel like, you know, I'm committed to that, you know, I'm committed to you know, what we in Arabic literature as writers, translators, readers, you know, and improving our conversation and expanding them, and also not thinking that, oh, this is, again, you know, this is happening somewhere else. Like, you know, there is, you know, there is some of it that we can engage with on the local level, or on the level of language, on the level of history. So there is that, and going back to this bigger question of like aesthetic and politics, you know, because modern Arabic literature is, you know, and I think maybe this can apply to a lot of post-colonial literatures, is that it is a committed literature, right? A lot of it is a committed literature, and a lot of it has been, you know, rebelling against committed literature as well, right? So, and I just thought, like, you know, this is one piece where, you know, the aesthetic actually does make these interventions, you know, does translate critiques and visions. Let's that's one thing that Butler possesses. When you said she's a theorist, I really believe so, because even this aspect of like when she was asked, why did you make Kevin white, and she was like, well, I didn't want her to have it easy. I was like, even though like nothing was easy about that, but she wanted to keep complicating things. And we see, like, for example, before Kevin, she loses Kevin, and he goes into that whole journey and becomes abolitionist and everything. Early on, she sees how he was easily getting used to early 19th century, and also how sometimes she keeps saying this happened several times at across the novel, is that she would say, he reminds me of Rufus, or Rufus reminds me of Kevin, or of Tom, and at first you don't get it, but then you understand why she is like subconsciously making that contrast. And what I really love is that in the return of Kevin, there is also something allegorical about I feel like Butler is saying like, this is, if we as a modern society, and by that of course she means like largely also like white people who want to be committed to a revisionist project and all of that, she's like, this is what would happen, like you would go through this journey and you would come back, and you wouldn't necessarily come back with answers, but it's like like an open process that we have to commit to, and we're not gonna feel and think the same. Don't expect that. Something is gonna be altered.
Yeah, thank you so much. To me, I think what you're just reminding us, right, that like the question of repair is so far out of her, like so far on the horizon, right? She's like, we can't even deal with repair until we actually encounter and engage the way that this is still working, that it's still happening. So yeah, there's a couple questions in the chat. I'll just flag two of them and you can answer those and then we'll move forward. And if you do have more questions, as Rebecca said, you can throw them in the chat, you can raise your hand, and we'll try to get to you. So the first is about the reflexive relationship between a person and author's like sort of standpoint and the world they imagine, the world building you're talking about. So how do you think Butler's themes and images might have been different if she had been born and raised in, I think then Larry corrected this to say Cairo. So had she been born in a different historical context, how might that imaginary have been a bit different? And then a second question is, what other, did you come across any sort of transliterational, like any cognates or any kind of words or terms that had a shared history that surprised you, or maybe the other way? Like, was there something, you talked about the shrug, which I find so fascinating. Like, how do you approach that like discursive challenge? Do you euphemize it? Is there like a different term or a different kind of action in context that would reflect the same kind of ambivalence or something?
Yeah, I like, I don't know, to imagine Butler as someone who grew up in Cairo, like, yeah, that's not something I could possibly just like answer right now, yeah, I don't know. I feel like, I could, this made me just remember other writers who, came from that context and tried to like, I guess, write about that context, like, so for example, just randomly, I remembered from Cairo, Salwa Bakr, Egyptian novelist, and she has this novel where she takes something really niche, a history that is very much underexplored, where of course in Muhammad Ali's time in Egypt, there used to be a lot of, basically they would abduct a lot of Sudanese people into the army to work in the army, and then she takes specifically this weird story where Muhammad Ali sends some of his army to Mexico to fight. I really don't know much about the context, but this is, I'm just mentioning this because I don't think this is alien to Arab writers, or Arabic writers. They've been writing like historically specific works. I guess what Butler has different, it's like, again, like she is able to create this cross-genre, hybrid genre that actually serves her vision. It's not just aesthetically pleasing or something, and that was fresh to me. That was, different to me. So I don't know if I can say more of like what could have possibly been if she grew up somewhere else, like that's just a hypothesis. But I want to say, when it comes to these words, so for example, with shrugging, of course we do have shrugging, in as like, as a cultural expression, but it plays differently. It could be like, oh yeah, I'm indifferent. It could be like rejection. It could be, so like I try to translate accordingly, when and I think that does play in with Butler too, so like I had to something that an English reader or a monolingual reader might not realize, because you're just like reading and you see the description, but I had to stop and understand, what does the shrug mean, right? Like how does it translate to? And a lot of the times, she uses shrugging as a way of like, avoiding conflict, right? Because she's in constant struggle with herself of like, don't speak, every time you speak you get in trouble, like, so like you can see, like first she picks up on the body language of the enslaved people around her, and then she starts to adopt the same body language with, and even though she puts it in the prose and in the dialogue, it still feels like Dana is not aware of it, right? It's like it does feel like it's like some subconscious thing. So I played on this in Arabic, so sometimes I would say بكتفيه, sometimes I would just like say like that he negated something, or she denied something, so I did play on variation, but also I did play on repetition, because I saw that was part of what she was doing. Yeah, I don't know what other words I can think of, but I mentioned the qafila, that stood out to me. I also want to say with the racial slurs as well, so for example, depending on who's speaking, it does change, right, in the novel. So you find like she uses, of course, a slave, she uses black, she uses and I don't know if she uses the word Negro, but she does use the N-word, right? And I wanted to like translate this into Arabic, and I was thinking like, okay, of course we have racial slurs too. Can I use some of these racial slurs, or would it be too domesticating, as we say in translation studies? Because so one thing that was interesting to talk about with the editor is that he was like, well, everybody translate all these racial slurs, not one of them, all of them as this word zinji in Arabic, which has been actually in modern translation, Arabic translation, was associated with negritude and the movement. And, when these, especially through Francophone, right, when they were translated. And then also like Harlem Renaissance, also, that word was used, but then of course it disappeared just from the American context, it disappeared in Arabic. But in Arabic, somehow it was used as, let's use it to as a substitute for the N-word. And I thought this is a big mistake that has become common, because I'm like, well, that word was not a slur, and now you're using it so. But also, racial language is very intentional in the novel, right? Like, and who says it and who doesn't. So yeah, I tried to actually I transliterated the N-word, into Arabic, because I noticed that everyone is familiar with the word now, so like I didn't think using a local substitute would be the best choice, I guess, especially with different Arabics that we have.
There's even an interesting moment to this question, and I see there's a couple questions that are kind of related to this. So this question from Keegan around the blog post. And there's the moment when she's talking to Rufus in the bedroom. So in the novel, the second time she goes back, Rufus can speak now. The first time she says he's 5 and he's unconscious. She doesn't ever communicate with him. But when she's in the room with him in her second encounter, he calls her the N-word and she says, please call me black, right? And so in the American context, we've skipped over Negro, we've skipped over African American, and there's something specifically in the 1979, 1980 resistive and generationally forward, to me anyway, in reading that is like, you will call me black, right? And this is a black woman saying this to a white child. She doesn't understand her context, but we do. So there's this also dramatic irony thing happening. So it's interesting to me that you would need to transliterate the slur into Arabic because of the baggage that's sort of associated with all these other ways of thinking and attaching to, right? And there's also this conversation, which I don't think we need to have here, but just about how we position this sort of violent racist language that loses, or for some people it doesn't have that kind of baggage to it, right? That is the first moment of real violence, the discursive violence that's going to happen to her, that's going to do this pacification work that you're describing. Rebecca wants to ask about reception and about the relationship between reception and the dystopian. I was so struck by, let me see if I can find it. You said, is it really dystopian if we witness it all the time, I think, right? And I am so obsessed with the way you put that, and with how the real desire to call everything that happens at any moment that is bad dystopia, and then to center our dystopian imaginaries in, like, to locate the site of critique in precisely the place we think it would be. Like, in some ways, of course, that's where it has to be, but in others, to me, it seems so uninteresting to be like, yes, the brutalist city is the site of dystopia. We got it. You know, we've all read 1984. So, yeah, you don't have this question because it was DM'd to me, but the recent popularity of historical fiction, the relationship of the dystopian and the proliferation maybe, or wider circulation of speculative narratives in the Arabic context. Were any of these contexts relevant in discussions with editors or publishers? Rebecca, was that a good summary? Great.
Yeah, I mean, first to say about the reception of the novel, you know, it just came out in November, so it's very fresh, but like already half of the copies are sold out, you know, so I'm really excited, you know, like to just know that, you know, people are interested and curious, and even though this is the first time Butler is translated, even though, you know, the sci-fi thing was not, you know, encouraging, you know, like the publisher was worried about that as like, oh, I don't know if I have an audience for this. And, you know, they're already think like, you know, I've been asked to translate the parables as well. So I would say like it's been enthusiastic, let's say. I really found it interesting how, for the Arabic readers, one thing they kept stressing in each review, you know, like readers' reviews, is they were fascinated with the fact that the novel made them sympathize with Rufus, you know, and one of the readers was like, even the old guy, you know, even the old guy. So they were fascinated with this, and my interpretation is that it's not, you know, like not all writers are able to dismantle this like moralistic power that the reader has over subjects and characters, you know. And you know, you also feel guilty, like you're like, oh, this is the bad guy, I shouldn't be sympathizing with this guy. But you know, she always, you know, even if we step outside that context and think of someone like Kevin, you know, she's always like contesting everyone and making you doubt everyone and suspect everyone, and like at the same time not judge them, because you're still like, she never gives you certainty, right? Because once you're certain, like you feel like, you know, again, like fulfilled and entitled to pass judgments or so. So I love that the you know, like a lot of these reviews stress the reading experience itself, you know, how it's transformative, how, you know, it's you know, shifted things, you know, and you know, like what do you do with these feelings? I think that's something you wanted to ask, Justin, like, and you know, the feelings, like how much he takes these feelings and like, you know, make bigger things out of them, and you know, like does not you know, doesn't feel scared, you know, to really fully explore them. Pity or empathy, sympathy, like anger, rage, all of that. Yeah. So and the second part, the second part of the question. What was it about sci-fi? I'm sorry.
Oh no, that's okay. So this again, just about like I at least I again I'm not knowing as much as others in the room do about the kind of Arab language publishing market, right? To me, my what I do know is that especially since 2012, right, since the Arab Spring, there seems to have been a kind of boom in the science fiction, Arab language science fiction publishing market, and also I would say too in like English language dystopian fiction that has a kind of Arab or Middle Eastern, North African standpoint. Exit West, right? The what's the other? I can't think of the other one now, but and maybe we can think too about the relationship and interpolation of anti-Blackness in conversations about in and around Arabic studies, Arab American studies, Black studies, and it's maybe some kind of Islamophobic takes at times. So just, what did you have conversations with your editors about the publishing market around Arab language science fiction? I think is Rebecca's question.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess like the cool thing about the fact that we don't have genre writing is that, it allows people to move more freely, write and publish more freely, I guess, because all you gotta say is that this is a novel, and even though the critics or the academics would come with the labels, while you're writing and publishing, that's really not part of the negotiation, that's not centric to the process. And yeah, and I wanted to say about like just like thinking about dystopian or thinking about like context, because I feel like, for example, like with Black Lives Matter, with how centric race is becoming in conversations across the world, a lot of the times it's not only like it's not only anti-Blackness, it's also how anti-Blackness could overlap with other things, right? So for example, anti-police, movements, and how much the two come together, or sometimes it could be other struggles, and then it becomes a conversation or a push and pull of like, oh, can we align our causes or not, so that has been interesting. And I want to say also, like, just if I circle back a bit about also like the racial language, because again, I really wanted to, just like think like, well, you can read this as part of understanding America, and part of our curiosity toward America, but also, how does this get placed in the Arabic context? And I noticed, for example, that naming is so important, right? And I think this is something, of course, in the US too. But like, for example, when I wrote an article one time critiquing an Arabic conference where it was about anti-Blackness, and I was disappointed that everyone in the conference was speaking about Black issues as like it's happening somewhere else, but also it's like, oh, our brothers and sisters, and like but as if like there are no Black Arabs, as if there are no Black Arab writers as well, or let's say Black writers writing in Arabic, so I wrote a critique about this, and I used the word aswad, Black, instead of the word asmar, which is dark, which is more common in Arabic, right? And it was funny that it was like non-Black Arabs who would come to me and be like, why did you use aswad? I don't think this is appropriate. I'm like, it literally means black, so like, because, and I understand that this is weird because there is no movement, or just now, there is movements that are using the word, aswad, or like, thinking about Blackness, because, that word has already been claimed and theorized in the US context, but not necessarily in the Arab context, and you see like how naming becomes a way to like contest things and provoke things, it's like, yeah. So, and that was just like wonderful to to witness, all these debates that happen on the margin. And I'm hoping to like process all of this in some kind of like paper, just as a historical document, I guess.
That would be great. I think too, you're calling us to think about, there's a question about there's a question from Sarah Hassan about if you travel back in time and have a Black Arab person moderate this conversation, how would it have changed the course of this event? And I'm not quite sure if you mean the conversation that Mona and I are having, or if you mean the conversation that if, for example, Dana was herself either a Black Arab or a Black Muslim, how that would change our sort of understanding of the story. I do think we need to sort of hold up the fact that, or the historical archive does show plenty of Black Muslims, Black people from the Arab world, broadly construed, right, who were brought over as part of the project of enslavement, and for whom those traditions were effaced in the interest of white supremacy, right? So that Christianity was one of the techniques that was used to oppress, not liberate. And which is not to say that there aren't various kinds of liberation theologies that emerge out of the Black church newly formed in the US, but rather that, like, when we're thinking about the forces of how identity is at work in the story, specifically in the sort of broader history of American enslavement, we do know that religion was not apart from, but was rather deeply invested in this work. And two, Mona, I think you're also calling us to think about, when you talk about policing and sort of solidarities between anti-police movements throughout the world, but also like a kind of global Black Lives Matter movement, right? That like articulations of terrorism that emerged from the Black radical tradition and Black radical activism in the 60s get mapped onto Arab and Muslim terrorists in the 70s and 80s, and then return to the site of, and of course in the post 9/11 period, right? And then get redeployed in 2013 and 2014 and 2015 and to 2020 to describe Black Lives Matter protesters. And only recently, right, in that sort of the internecine moment of the 1990s, and then like 5 days ago, when suddenly there was a realization that white quote unquote radicals were the actual terrorists, were the ones who were sort of deploying affect as a tool of political destabilization. So I think that these connections are super important. I'm going to go to Angela's question. I was thinking exactly the emergent Black Iraqi rights activism. This is a comment, but I'll share it. So what Mona, you're saying now about practices that travel and the protest movements that overlap, I was thinking exactly the emergence of Black Iraqi rights activism. In Iraqi Arabic, at least the word abd, I think, is still used, and the broader shared histories internationally are not reckoned with. I also think we can sort of use, Mona, where you've taken us to think back to a moment you sort of gestured to earlier, which is in thinking about like how a kind of story of enslavement and captivity can have political utility in the present, right? So we can think about, as you've mentioned, quote unquote forced migration, right? Or the kind of contemporary enslavement where people are dispossessed of passports and put to work in various kinds of like just horrible conditions, thinking with Naomi Peck's work there and others. Or the kind of way that modern slavery is deployed to both like undermine contemporary labor practices under kind of global neoliberal processes, but also is like a real concern that we should have about our orientation to people trafficked as part of global processes. And so I guess maybe a last question for you is just, how do you want people to read and encounter the book? Like, what do you want them to sort of take away as they finish your work?
I don't know. I guess what to add, after, like, I feel like I've said so much toward that, and yeah, I feel like, if you read this novel, it will lead you, like each of my friend who was like, I'm gonna start reading this novel, I'm like, just give it 20 pages, it will steal you away, because that was my experience every time I read it. Is that it's that hunting and like powerful kind of story. And I love that Butler was like, oh, I'm gonna write this really dense piece that is also like page turner, as they say, right? Like I love this ambition, and I love that this ambition was made possible. So I feel like I personally, as even though like being a writer myself, like I feel scared of politicized the readings overcoming the text, but it's important, right? So like this is one opportunity where we were able to like explore that fully, but there's so much in the novel to enjoy, about humans and about all these feelings that we take for granted, but she is able to generate so much out of them, You know, this dispossession, you know, and I feel like, again, I love that, you know, when she encounters sexual violence, she does go all the way and explore it, you know, and when she thinks about oppression beyond slavery, she thinks like in the capitalist context, she doesn't shy away from that. And then even like the fact that she hints at faraway places, like, you know, when she travels back to the 70s, you see her saying, oh, I'm listening to the radio, and there's apartheid in South Africa, or like there is the, you know, the wars breaking out in Beirut. You know, I love this, you know. And the thing is about Butler is that she plays well on distance, you know, and so she's like, okay, even though I'm giving you this, you know, really I don't know, horrifying experience of slavery that you are seeing in the lives of these characters, by the way, this is not all that happened during slavery. This is not the only representative, you know. And she lets herself just be like, through the conversation, hint at even more difficult things happening, but also hint at the rebellions that were happening, right? Like there's always something happening in the background. She's like, well, 20 miles from here, Harriet Tubman, you know, like would do this, or, you know, so like I love that, you know, sometimes things just happen in the background and they do play a powerful role in it, you know. Yeah, so I guess, you know, the book carries itself, you know, it has so much to offer. I am very confident, you know, that once you start, you will not stop. You know, I hope this is a good entry for people to explore Butler, but also this genre and this generation of writers. You know, there's so much to think with.
Thanks so much. I'm gonna let Yasmina have the last question here. So is there anything next? Maybe this is a too aggressive of a question since you just finished this thing, but if there is something we should all stay tuned for, Rebecca mentioned another text that I don't know if it's coming or if it's out already, but just share where you are and what we should all be looking for.
Yeah, actually my next translation is coming out in English, and is, I don't know if it's any relevant to this, but it's like of an Iraqi poet, Ra'ad Abdulqadir. It's coming out in March out of Ugly Duckling Presse. And, you know, this is one thing to say is that I'm someone who translates poetry, you know, and this was my first in fiction. And I was like, I promise this is gonna be the last. So, but yeah, like it's been a wonderful experience, and I've been asked to translate the parables. I don't know if this is gonna happen, and you know, that's also a different style of Butler, you know, like and I'm just like so intimidated again. Yeah, so hopefully, I don't know, hopefully that happens.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Mona, for this conversation. And I'll just echo in the sentiment in the chat that we're really grateful to be listening to you and your brilliant answers and your brilliant questions about Butler, about translation, about kind of global networks of white supremacy, about the long histories of intersection of those histories. And I just thank you so much for that. And so please thank me, join me in thanking everyone for coming today. So thank you all.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Justin. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you all so much.